concept, or is it a proxy for something larger? And so these are sort of the questions that circulated through my mind. But it had much more of a personal dimension than beyond this sort of intellectual consideration. So this is a picture of my maternal grandmother. Really the only grandparent that I knew growing up in life. She was my mom's mom. And down at the bottom, you see a little bit of background. She grew up in the rural Virginia area in the 1930s and 40s. Those of you familiar with that book by Henrietta Lacks, the woman from Johns Hopkins, my grandmother grew up in that same, about 5 miles away, same era. So if you have a sense of what that book and the story and the scene is like, that's sort of kind of what my grandmother's life was like growing up. She moved to Washington, D.C. Her husband left her with 3 kids when they were all very young. And she worked as the term changes over time, but as a housekeeper or maid. And that was her life. And so again, the only grandparent I knew. And growing up, we would go to visit her pretty often after church. And I remember my mom would talk about her high blood pressure and how she needed to be treated, and my grandmother had different ideas about what that meant. So I always knew that. But then as a senior in college, my grandmother became more significantly ill. She had a stroke, and then she was able to recover from the first stroke pretty well, but then the second stroke caused sort of permanent physical and mental changes, and she was never the same at that point. And this is all during my senior year of college as I'm getting ready to go to medical school. And then during that first year of medical school, she developed heart failure, which is ultimately what killed her. So if you think about those 3 disorders, hypertension, high blood pressure, stroke, and heart failure, those are all more common among African Americans, and African Americans who get those disorders have worse outcomes. So that narrative that was learned in the classroom had a very personal kind of meaning to me. That meaning became even more potent to me as a first-year medical student a few months later. So I know you have a great medical school here, and I hope your students so this is basically around a picture of me around the time as a first-year medical student. I searched long and hard for a picture with me with a sunnier kind of temperament or disposition, and this is the best that I could come up with. So hopefully your medical students are having a better experience than I did. But about 6 months after my grandmother passed away, those of you in the medical world know that doctors learn sort of the basic clinical skills by practicing on one another. You measure blood pressure, you draw blood on one another, and that's how you sort of learn how to do those things. And so one day a classmate was measuring my blood pressure, and it was really high. Well over the 140 or 90 cutoffs. And so our first thought was that, we're all novices, maybe she doesn't know how to do it. So you bring in the professor, he confirms that it's elevated, and he recommends that I go to the Student Health Center to kind of get checked out. I go a few days later, and they draw some blood, some urine samples. They found out that I have some early signs of kidney disease, which is a complication of high blood pressure. So for me at this point in my life, I was 23 years old. I had played sports and basketball in college and thought of myself as physically vibrant. So the idea that I would have these potentially chronic and life-threatening ailments at such a young age was really striking. And it really hit me like a ton of bricks. And this idea about race and medicine sort of took on a more urgent need to sort out to make sense of what it was all about. So that's sort of how this sort of genesis of how this all kind of evolved for me personally. How I went from someone who was not inclined to really pursue these issues to someone who became really engaged with these issues. Now, as you go out into the medical school world, you start to see people in the world, and you get to see a sense of what's really going on. And why are we having these challenges and these issues? The next handful of slides talk about the system or structural factors that are at work. These are a couple just data points to sort of talk about. There's this issue about race and health insurance. We'll talk a little bit more about health insurance later. But just to give you a quick example, so black people are certainly more likely to be uninsured, and when they do have insurance, they're more likely to have Medicaid versus a private insurance. I'll go into detail what that looks like, why is that important, in a couple slides. There's also this tremendous issue about residential segregation that we continue to have in our country that sort of has so many roles in terms of how it impacts health, where there's the simple access to care, but also the types of schools we go to, the food, trauma, exposure, violence, all these things are sort of intertwined. Here's an image right here that sort of kind of gives you an example of that. So this is North Carolina, 2 places where folks can go to get food, 15, 20 miles apart. You can see the stark, striking difference of kind of what that all entails. Interestingly enough, medical school historically doesn't teach you a lot about nutrition at all, which is an entirely different subject. But it's just something you think about. You go into a store on the left and you see what's there. And I've been in these sorts of places, and you just sort of see the striking differences that take place there. There's a story in the book where I talk about going to work in a clinic in a small town in North Carolina. There's the proverbial railroad track that divides the town. It literally was a town that's 50% black, 50% white. Had maybe 2,000 or 3,000 residents. At the time, they had no actual regular medical provider. And so Duke established this kind of relationship with the town where students could go and work in this free clinic. It was a clinic that was once a month, held on a Saturday morning. And you basically, so the advantage for Duke was that it allowed an opportunity for students to get education, exposure to health in a way they wouldn't otherwise. And the advantage for the community was that there was some access to medical care they would not get. So this isn't the actual clinic, but this is a pretty good representation of what that clinic looked like. It was sort of like an old kind of country trailer. It wasn't actually a medical clinic. And the patients there, again, it was just striking to see that we went there with our own. The interesting thing about North Carolina, it's true for many states, is that you're at a place like Duke or Raleigh, there's sort of this sense that you're in the modern sort of, progressive kind of sense. And then you go each step along the highway, it feels like you're going further and further back in time. And that was sort of the sense of this clinic in this town. It had a very 50-ish kind of feel to it. This isn't the actual person, but this is a representation of her who really struck with me the most, was this idea of how health insurance plays out and how the system itself is so flawed in so many ways. When you're in a place like Duke, there's this sort of sense that there's this ethos that it doesn't matter what the person's insurance is, we're going to treat who's ever there, we're going to do the best for them that we can. Not always true, but largely true. But then you get out into an hour away and you realize that people have problems that are very easily treatable, but because of our system, the way it's set up, we can't really get care. So this was a woman who was 40 years old. She came to the clinic. She'd been having heavy bleeding for about 6 months during her menstrual cycle and also even in between her cycles. And it was very heavy bleeding. It was quickly determined that it was something called uterine fibroids. These are benign tumors in the fibroids. Very treatable disease. We also found out that she had significant high blood pressure, very high blood pressure, even worse than mine. Again, very treatable. The challenge was, though, how are we going to get her treatment? So the way this clinic worked, we brought samples from Duke to this clinic, and so she was the last person we saw that day. We ran out of samples. Couldn't help her in that sense. But even more importantly, this issue of how to treat her uterine bleeding, this was really striking to me. So she didn't have health insurance. She worked full-time. It's something that we weren't taught about, was really naive about. This idea that a person could work because people have all these perceptions that are often ill-informed. Someone thinks, well, someone doesn't have health insurance, well, and somehow they've done something to deserve not being in that situation. This is the kind of way that our society often kind of works. This is a person who's following all the sort of societal rules, full-time job, married, all the things that people think we should be doing, but we're still finding ourselves falling through the cracks. And the thing that our supervisor said that they always kind of stuck with me, he said that the only way she's going to really get treatment is if somehow her condition worsens such that it becomes an emergency. And I thought to myself, like, how perverse is that a person has a treatable condition, but because of our dynamics of healthcare would have to get worse before she could actually get care? Because in the area where she lived, there was really no opportunity for her to get health care to treat her condition. So it was a really just striking and powerful example of how our system sort of can fail people, despite their best efforts. My specialty is psychiatry. In some ways, these things are even more prominent and more problematic in psychiatry. This is just some quick data. I know it may be hard to see, so I'll just read it out. So in the mental health realm, black people are significantly less likely to receive psychiatric treatment for conditions that are comparable to white people. And so you have someone with depression or anxiety, they're much less likely to get treatment for that. When black people are seen in the mental health system, it's much more likely to be in an emergency room setting, or in a psychiatric hospital, or to be what's called involuntarily committed. And I'll talk about that real quickly. So one night, I was on call on duty in the hospital, and there were two 20-something women that came in back to back, and they had very similar kinds of stories. They both had recently broken up with boyfriends and had this sort of less than ideal response where they took an overdose. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was something that needed sort of mental health attention. Very, very similar stories, but the outcomes were strikingly different. So the first person, she was white, she had health insurance. She was admitted to our university unit. Most people there were like her. They had depression, anxiety, those kinds of problems, trouble coping. Each team would have at most 8 patients per team. No one wants to be in a mental health hospital, but it was the sort of approach that would be most useful for her. The second patient, no health insurance. And this is how the system kind of can fail people. So couldn't go to our inpatient unit because of this issue of health insurance. That was sort of the overriding force. But then as you try and transfer it, you call other hospitals to try and transfer it to another hospital, they all kind of have reasons why they can't take her. And it's about insurance, but they can't actually say that, so they come with all these other reasons why they can't take her. So that left only one option for her, which was a state hospital. Now, a state mental health hospital has its valid use. It's useful, but patients there tend to be much sicker. Mania, psychosis, with something called antisocial personality. Many people there have committed violent acts, crimes, those sorts of things. Not the best place for a woman with her situation. There are many more patients per team. It's much harder to follow patients. But the most difficult part about that was that for her to be transferred from our hospital to the state hospital, under our laws, she had to be involuntarily committed. So this means that she actually had to, we had to call the police. And she had to be put in sort of the garb you would, like, orange garb, prison garb almost, and she had to be handcuffed, and she had to be taken from point A to point B. So just imagine 2 people coming, this is your first exposure to the mental health system, you're in a crisis, and you're basically treated in effect as a prisoner, and it's all rooted in this idea that you don't have health insurance. I mean, it's just such a, these are the kind of stories I think are often lost in our larger system as we discuss these issues. It was an incredibly striking experience to see and be part of it, and to sort of be there. And the worst part about it is you're there as a doctor, and you kind of know what this person needs, but then you're in some sense powerless because there are these larger forces that are taking place in their work. So it was a really striking experience to have. Other aspects to this issue of difference in treatment is there's this issue of the doctor-patient dynamic. Again, there's this sense in medicine historically that we are sort of somehow immune to that, and we're somehow above that based on our education and all these other sorts of things, commitment to science. But again, the idea of the human aspect is undoubtedly present. So this is I'll quickly tell you this story of a gentleman who this is a few years later, and now I'm an intern. I'm in the medical intern, and a guy comes admitted to our hospital. He had chest pain for about a week. Obviously, if you think about chest pain, you're most concerned about heart disease. And we went through all the usual tests to rule out the fact that he did not have a heart attack. And then we went through all the sort of secondary things, like what are we going to do now? We want you to stop smoking. We need to work on your diet, all the usual things that you would do. So towards the end, there was a discussion about taking blood pressure medicine, and the patient was borderline elevated, but he wanted to work on his diet and lose weight and start exercising, all the things that you should do. And we had this discussion back and forth with the team. All this seemed reasonable to me. It seemed reasonable probably to most of you in the audience. But the team sort of kind of was taken aback by his level of knowledge about some of these subjects. And it was really striking because as we left the room, they had this discussion led by the supervisor, and he brought up the question, well, what do you think is going on with this guy? And he said it to the other members of the team. So my thought was that he's talking about, well, is it underlying heart disease? Does he have reflux? Does he have an ulcer? Medical kind of things, right? And this is what sort of came from it. They started to sort of debate this deliberation about whether or not he had OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And they were going back and forth in this sort of dismissive way towards psychiatry, but really going on and on about this, about what do you think is going on with this guy? How can he, because the way he was sort of talking, and I couldn't believe it. And in the end, they said, oh, well, they sort of played around with these diagnoses, and they said, well, this is what we think he has. Now, psychiatry labels are nothing, as a psychiatrist, these are things that are nothing to sneeze at. So these kinds of things go in your chart, and they can follow you as you go on. So the next time this guy comes into the emergency room, he has chest pain, they may see this label and say, oh, well, he's just somebody who's anxious, and this is not really serious. And it was all generated by something that really just didn't, it was all generated by something that seemed illogical to me. At the time, I was not a psychiatrist, and it seemed illogical, and now I'm a psychiatrist, and it still seems equally illogical that they came up with this label. And that was their response to his sort of he was a seemingly uneducated African American male, but he was was particularly interested in this idea of nutrition, and somehow they took this to mean that there was something wrong with him. So again, there's this idea of how bias can intrude in the medical encounter. There's several studies of this that have been done, looking at how perceptions of physicians that African American people are less intelligent, less educated, more likely to use drugs. This one's been something that's really, it's been refuted over and over again, but it continues to be, so powerful, this idea that black people are more likely or more prone to use drugs. And we see how that sort of played out with the whole issues of the opiate epidemic. There's this notion that African Americans were less likely to receive opiates because there's perception they'll be more prone to abusing it. There's all sorts of things like that that have gone on. There was a study recently on that subject a couple years ago from the University of Virginia, where they looked at surveyed medical students and young medical doctors there, and their perceptions of African Americans and pain tolerance. There was this idea that African Americans had higher pain tolerance and different sort of physiology, and were immune to pain. And it's all sort of rooted in these sort of old, antiquated narratives that have kind of date really back to the era of slavery. But again, this idea of how there's a sense that somehow medicine might be immune to these larger things, but again, it's a faulty notion. There's also on the flip side this idea of how there's this mistrust that often is evoked, and that black patients often are less likely to trust doctors, particularly in emergency room settings, hospital settings, urgent care settings. I can't tell you how many times I've been brought in as something of like a medical translator, if you will, where a team will bring in, they'll say, well, Damon, can you assure this person that what we're doing is the appropriate level of care? And again, that just sort of speaks to this sort of gap or divide that we've struggled to deal with. So again, this idea of me being a medical translator. There's also this notion of, so this is more on the personal side of things here, this idea of what my journey was like as a young African-American male going through the medical system itself. I like to think of it as the good, the bad, and the awkward. It's all about perception. So when someone sees me and looks at me, the last thing that people often were going to think is that, medical doctor. I'm sure, if you're honest with yourselves, many of you probably, if you saw me in a different setting, that may not be the first thing that would come to your mind as well. Typically, I'm tall, I'm about 6'6", so the typical thing might be basketball, right? Sure. I was okay, but if I relied on that to have paid the bills, I would be in bad shape right now. But there's that perception. But of course, many times it was much worse perception, things that would come encounter. There's sort of all these stories we're seeing in the news now about people in these different encounters, whether it's at a Starbucks or whatever, and people are sort of seeing someone and then making assumptions that aren't necessarily rooted in anything other than based on physical appearance. I've had many experiences like that in different settings. It's something that when I was younger was very much an issue that occurred. The sense of being perceived as a threat. Went to this is a little bit off the subject, but one time went to like a Dunkin' Donuts store one time many years ago. This is actually when I lived in Connecticut. And as I walked into the store, I'd come from the gym, I was in sweat clothes, and the guy was looking at me kind of funny from the moment I walked in. And then as I got to the line, I pulled my wallet out and paid the bill, he had this sense of relief. He said, and he was enormously candid. He said, well, gee, I really kind of thought you were going to jack us up. It's like, well, so I was like, well, why would you think that? It's like I got kind of a little bit like probed him. He said, oh, no, it's not racial. It's just that you look like somebody that would commit a crime. Wow. Right. So, no, so you just, so it's just, so suffice to say, I don't go back to, I've not patronized that store since. But yeah, so there are all sorts of these subtle kinds of things that have happened that are present, and it's all kind of rooted in this perception of what people see when they see you. So this is played out in all sorts of ways in my medical journey, all right? So there's the positive side. There's a certain pride that people might experience from seeing a black doctor, particularly in the South, particularly North Carolina. You'll get that from black patients, but you also get that from some white patients who will say, well, it's really great to sort of see that maybe there's been some sign of progress from our history that we've had. So there's that kind of experience. But then there's also these many kind of negative sort of limiting experiences that you have. I write about in the book. I'll just kind of quickly mention them for those of you who've already read the book. But as a first-year medical student, down at Duke, the first couple weeks of class, I'm in a lecture hall. I come out for a break, come back in. The professor approaches me at the entrance to the lecture hall and says, are you here to fix the lights in the classroom? So okay, so there's this misunderstanding. I'm one person who doesn't want to automatically jump to the race. That was not my sort of initial thing I wanted to jump to. I wanted to think of any other possibility other than that. And we kind of go back and forth. And eventually, I said, no, I think you got us all kind of confused. It's a misunderstanding. And then he says, well, then why are you here? So there was this idea that I couldn't be in his classroom as a black student. And for me, so, you know, the struggle was, what do you do with that information? Because some people might think that you're just sort of reading something into something that's not there, you're being overly sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. They may not get it. And you don't want to be someone who just sort of causes, you know, trouble when you're just starting out at a place like Duke. So that was sort of my sense of it. So what I had to do is kind of prove to myself, because there was a sense in me that maybe I didn't belong in some sort of metaphorical way, because I come from a very lower income background. I'm in this place where all the kids are children of professors and doctors, et cetera. Maybe I don't belong in some way. So I had to kind of prove to myself that I did, and I just found myself studying around the clock more than I really learned I could live without sleep for an extended period of time during that period of time. And I ended up getting one of the highest grades in the class. And after the end of that course, as a matter of routine, we had to sign out with the professor for the final kind of exit interview, if you will. And it was just striking to sort of see how his reaction to seeing that I'd gotten like the second highest score in the class. It was a sense of like disbelief at first. He was like, come on, I can't believe this. And then it became something like magic, like I must be magical now. And so it was like, it really just spoke to this idea of how people, you know, as much as I may want to go into a situation and feel like I'm like anyone else in it, you know, there's always these external forces that you'd have to encounter and deal with and learn how to cope with. And that was sort of that my experience would somehow be fundamentally different just by virtue of being African American. It happened again a few years later as a young doctor in medical school, a young doctor in a residency. I was an intern a few weeks into the internship, and a patient came into the hospital and said, I don't want to see a N-word doctor. I just happened to be the only African-American doctor on this whole sort of large team of doctors that were rotating through. I happened to be the only one, and he happened to come in on the night that I was on duty, and just worked out that way. And you know, I came down to the emergency room, and the nurse said, watch out, be careful. And at first, usually when people say that, they mean that the patient might be aggressive or violent or agitated, but she said, no, he doesn't want to see an N-word person. And then you go into the room, and then his family has like Confederate flag tattoos and shirts, and so you're in a situation where you're like, again, you want to just be like you're a doctor, you're trying to just adjust to that struggle of being a young doctor, but then you're being forced into this situation where you're somehow different, and you have to learn how to cope with that. And so that was sort of this sort of larger theme of what it was like in my experience. So there's also this larger notion. This goes beyond medicine, but just more broadly to society. This is a photo of W.E.B. Du Bois, the first famous African-American philosopher, first person to get a PhD from Harvard, first African-American person to get a PhD from Harvard. And there's this notion of always being in a world where you sort of feel like you're living in two different worlds at the same time, simultaneously. The term here is double consciousness, this idea that you're constantly sort of seeing yourself and being viewed in two different worlds at the same time. And there's a real sort of psychological kind of toll that sort of is born out from that. This notion of sort of feeling like you have a foot in both worlds, but you don't really feel like you have both feet in either world. There's sort of this constant kind of theme that pervades you know, that experience of sort of seeing patients that very much reminded me of my own personal life, but then being part of a medical system which was very different from that. And sort of how do you navigate those two worlds? I think here's another interesting piece. So the next slide is going to talk about, when we talk about this issue of health differences, a lot of times people want to just sort of say it's exclusively an issue of social class. And I think to a large extent, there is a big part to social class. But this is an interesting study I think you guys may, it's kind of a busy slide, but let me try and explain. This is really worth discussing. So Meharry is an African-American medical school in Nashville, Tennessee. Johns Hopkins, of course, you know, in Baltimore, Maryland. So researchers from each school collaborated between 1957 and 1965. And so Meharry's all African-American. And back in those days, you know, medical schools weren't so progressive, so they're pretty much all male in both sides. So it's basically going to be in comparison of black men from Meharry and white men from Johns Hopkins, because that's who were at those schools at the time. So they collected data over 8 years, and they followed these doctors in their lives for the next 30 years. And they found a significantly worse outcome among the black male physicians, higher incidence of hypertension, diabetes, premature death than the white cohorts from Johns Hopkins. What I think is interesting about that is that here we are, if you look at these two people in a snapshot in time, they're both doctors, ostensibly successful, doing well in their lives in many ways, right? So not mired by sort of the issues of class that you would think about being so important to health, but still having these radically different health outcomes. And what's behind that, right? There was a more recent article, I guess in the New York Times recently, where they talked about this issue about infant mortality, and this idea that extends beyond just the idea of class. Even when you control for socioeconomic class, there's still these real different outcomes. So I think it's an interesting point to ponder. And I think what cross-sectional data doesn't account for is the idea of what went into the differences between the journeys that were, like, what's the difference between my journey and what the experience that I had and continue to have, how fundamentally different they were, and how that may in turn impact health in all sorts of ways. Since the book has come out, I've had so many classmates from medical school and people I train with respond back to me and say, well, I'm amazed. How could your experience have been so much different than mine? We were in the same classroom, the same hospital ward. How could we've had such different experiences? And I think it's something that's largely not captured, and in some ways can kind of transcend class. And so this study kind of is interesting in that way because it kind of bears that out in its own sort of way. So I just think it's a fascinating thing to sort of think about. When you think about the demographics of African Americans in medicine, so 13% of the U.S. population is African American. Within medicine, it's about 3.8% of practicing physicians, so that's a significantly lower number. Why might this be important? So here's a common scenario. We'd have an African American male come to a clinic, in my case in psychiatry, referred to mental health by a general primary care doctor, and the referrals for stress or depression, and the request is for a black doctor. This happens a lot. The request can come from the doctor, the request can come from the patient. In practice, it happens a lot. When I was in training, I was the only African-American provider in our clinic that served about 40–50% African-American patients. And so my first few weeks there, I got so many requests. It was like, Damon, we need you to see this patient. Damon, we need you to see this patient. I'm thinking to myself, I'm one person trying to just learn the craft like everyone else, but again, being reminded that there were these external factors that would make my experience uniquely different. And so it was a sense of feeling overwhelmed by that. And so again, you see these requests. This next slide is going to be hard to see, but I'm just going to give you a general sense. So look at the red. So the red is for the African American population. So U.S., it's about 13%. North Carolina is going to be higher, low 20s, and then the red on the right for Durham is approaching 40%. So you get that sense there. Now this is a trend that extends beyond Duke. Another busy slide, but take a look here. So on the far right, the national average African American is 13%, and then I list various cities through the U.S. So it starts with Boston and New York, where it's about double the national rate, and then you go up to Baltimore, where it's 2/3 of the population is African American. So these cities all have in common that they are homes to enormously large and influential and prestigious medical schools and hospitals and teaching hospitals where the next generation of doctors are trained. And what's happening is that, so this is sort of like that proverbial elephant in the room, that doctors are being trained in this environment with large African-American populations. There's issues that are happening but are being largely not talked about. But it's an extremely important issue. So that just sort of gives you a visual of that. This is data from the mental health world, psychiatry, psychology. The numbers are quite low. And you think about mental health and how personal and how intimate that discussions can be, what people have and they want to discuss. And often people will request providers that are the same race, but it's often just not conceivably possible because of the reasons we discussed. But what role might it be? So is it really beneficial to have a black doctor if you're a black patient? Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that that's the goal, that we should have segregated medicine, that every person should see a doctor. Because I think for one, it's not feasible. For two, I think there's great value in actually being able to interact and know people of different backgrounds. So I'm not advocating for that, but there is a segment of the population where this can be extremely important, given a historical mistrust that continues to exist. So several studies from the 90s and 2000s have shown that African-American doctors are more likely to practice in areas where there are large black populations. So there's an improved access to care component. Black patients often have reported more favorable interactions in these settings, and at the bottom, there's actually been studies that have shown that there's been actually some better outcomes. The patient comes in and they want a minority provider of the same race. There's studies that looked at how they actually did better in that setting. So I think there's some value to this. So it's really an important issue that it needs to be thought about more thoroughly. Kind of moving forward, so I've laid out a lot of large problems, right? How do we even begin to sort of think about fixing these problems? This is a little bit older slide, but it still kind of really touches on this idea of healthcare. And I know that there'll be those of you who want to talk about the healthcare system itself, so I wanted to kind of briefly look at that. So I would say that the health insurance is a necessary, but not necessary, but get my term right. Necessary but not sufficient way to look at how do we improve health. It's really important, as I illustrated in several examples, how things really play out differently. Our system's a mess, right? How else can we put it? So there's all sorts of theories that have been put out, and we can certainly talk about that, whether we want a socialized system like what's in the VA, whether you want more of a Medicare for all program where you still have the private component to it. There's other ways of sort of thinking about this. I think the point is that we have to have some system, whatever we come up with, where there's a baseline level of health insurance for everyone, and then we can sort of work out the details from there, how that will look. But I think it's, as I talk about my book and how I've seen so many times, it really is a kind of a tragedy that we continue to not be able to sort of move forward. If anything, there's certain things in life that clearly have a partisan dimension. And I understand that there's a partisan aspect to it, but it seems like this will be an area where there could be a real compromise. But clearly, we're not. We continue to sort of fail in that regard. And I'm happy to sort of talk more about that later. But certainly, that's a big part of the problem, and we have to move forward. There's another piece to the puzzle. I talked a lot about doctor-patient relationships. I'm a psychiatrist. Bias, all these things, and how it all comes into play. It can happen in all sorts of directions, right? And so I wanted to kind of tell you a quick example of how can we move past that and move forward, and just give you a quick example of how that worked for me. So several years ago, I was working at a VA clinic. I had taken over the care of this young gentleman who the previous doctor was sort of very similar to him in a demographic kind of way, very similar, and I had taken over this guy's care. And I remember looking through his chart before I met him, and already sort of forming impressions of him as I was looking through his chart. And in some ways, these details are really kind of innocent details, but this is how bias affects all of us, right? So I'm looking through his chart, and I see that he likes motorcycles. Motorcycles to me are scary. He likes NASCAR. Well, you know, driving in circles doesn't appeal to me. My wife likes it, doesn't appeal to me. I mean, it just shows you how people can sort of form biases based on things that are really innocent. You know, he liked hunting. I kind of thought guns were, my dad was into that, but I kind of thought that was kind of scary. So there are all these different things, and so I'm forming this image of a person based on data, and images aren't necessarily, maybe they're not as favorable, maybe they're not favorable, right? And so I found myself with this sort of train of thought. And then he comes into the room, and his initial impression is the same way. He's like, come on, you got to be kidding. You can't be my doctor. He doesn't want to have the door closed, right? And so it was this weird sort of tension we had there. I didn't know, was that because he was having underlying, was that his baseline, or was that because something about me particularly that he felt that way? Who knew? Then I started to ask him several questions, and they're all sort of very one-word answers, very abrupt, very terse. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy's never going to come back to see me, and maybe I'm happy for it. That was sort of my mind. Again, these are the things that happen to people, and I think we have to be honest and sort of think through. But then I thought to myself, you know what, we can do better than this. I can do better. I should try harder. You know, and this guy's had been through a lot. You know, he'd been in war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd been through a lot. Let me try something different, try harder. So I asked about his family. Again, and that's something that we all kind of have in our own way to connect. And then as he went through some details, he mentioned that he and his dad liked to shoot pool, play pool, right? Billiards. Very innocent, benign detail. But it was something that really resonated with me because it was a connection I had with my own dad growing up. And I was like, oh, wow. You like that? And we talked a little bit about that for maybe 30 seconds or a minute. And then he could see that he started to sort of become a little bit more engaged and started to talk more. And so that was kind of the very beginning. And then he came back for the next appointment, which I wasn't sure at first, but he did. And we started to talk more about, a little bit more about pool, a little bit more about his family. And before he knew it, you know, he was coming back to see me on a regular basis. And he'd been through a lot. You know, he'd been in Afghanistan, he'd been in Iraq, he'd been in both places. He was struggling with the adjustment to that. very real struggle. But then I followed him through for several years as he got, he went back to school, he got engaged, he got married, he had children, and he did really well. And so initially he was on, psychiatric medication. That was sort of the reason why he had to come back. But eventually he got to the point where he didn't need that any longer, and he was still doing well. And it was just sort of this illustration of how you have an example of how we were completely different people, totally different worlds, and how there was this ability to sort of make a connection. And I thought it really struck with me. And it's something that, doctors will complain, well, it takes too long. We don't have enough time to see patients. But it only took like a couple minutes for us to make that little bit of a connection, a little bit of effort that I made, and suddenly it was something different. And so I think this is something that obviously replicated over a much larger scale has to happen, but we have to start with this idea of even acknowledging that we have this propensity or tendency for bias, right? And how do we move forward from that bias? We have to even begin to have that discussion to move forward. And so that was something that was an experience I thought was really resonated with me in a much larger way. Obviously, we have certainly not done enough in our country to sort of address the issues of segregation and residential segregation, the communities, the adverse exposures that people have. This is something that we continue to need to work toward. It's a much larger discussion. There's an interesting book that came out about a year or two ago by a physician named David Ansel. He's based out of Chicago. It's called The Death Gap. It looked at this idea of zip code mortality and how life expectancy in one zip code, Chicago, was like 15 years less than the one that was sort of right down about a mile away. And just looking at that sort of issue and about how do we establish healthier communities, integrated communities, really interesting. This is the kind of thing I think is ultimately going to have to happen on local levels and then sort of more fan out that way versus from a top-down standpoint. But it's something that's crucial to this larger discussion. I wanted to kind of leave you with this final quote from Dr. King, where he says, if I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. I think sometimes these issues of the racial divide that we have are so immense. They've been going for so long. There's a sense of helplessness that can kind of creep in. You think, well, what can I do as one individual to address problems that are so rooted in a long and ugly history? I would encourage you to reject that sense of hopelessness that can creep in. I think we often underestimate what our own capacity as individuals are to sort of affect change. Maybe you can't change everything, certainly, but there's this tremendous ability to change individual lives in ways that that people sometimes lose sight of. So picture me now as a 8th grader, 14 years old, almost as tall as I am now, and in a middle school that was considered low performing, 98% African American. Most people not on the trajectory to go to college at all, much more likely to maybe be in the criminal justice system. That was sort of the experience that I had. I always had a thing for numbers, like in this kind of weird way. I liked sports page and reading box scores of baseball games. I had a thing for numbers. So I did well on a math test, and I had a teacher in 8th grade who said, and I did well on another math test, and she said, you should really consider testing for this science and tech magnet program that we have at our high school. And my initial reaction, coming from my community and knowing what that school, kind of having an idea what it was like, would be like, no, I don't want to be part of that. I'm going to be ostracized here, and I'm not going to fit in there, and that's just too much. I can't do that. That was my initial reaction for a while. Now, someone could have just written me off there and said, okay, well, he doesn't want to help himself. Let's just move on. People do that. You could write someone off that way. he doesn't know what's good for him. Too bad. But this teacher persisted. She pushed on. She said, you really should do this. This could really change your life. And then she called my mom. She went to the step of calling my mom at home and saying, I think your son really should consider this. You really should do this. And once my mom found out, she's like, you're crazy. You're going to take this test. Like, what do you, because I even kept it from my mom. I didn't want to tell her or anything like that. I wanted to hold back because I really felt like it would be a bad thing for me in some way that maybe seems not rational looking at it now. So I ended up doing it, and then I took the test, and I said, oh man, nothing's going to come of this. But then I found out about a month or maybe 6 weeks later that I'd done well on it, particularly the math part, and I'd gotten into this program. And so when I got into that program, so I was one of the only black students in the program. And to kind of give you a quick little historical detail about it, in my chemistry class, I was the only black student. And so there were some rocky points. I was the only black student, and there was this political sort of symposium that came to our school because we were like a school of excellence for STEM, and there were several politicians that came. Among them, Ted Kennedy, at the time Senator of Massachusetts, of course, Governor Bill Clinton, It was a while ago, right? From Arkansas, and there were several other people who came from both political parties. And I just remember being the only black student in that class, and these folks come through our class. And what the school did actually, because it wasn't just a magnet school, it was also a general high school, which was overwhelmingly black, but there was this sort of separate magnet program. So they sort of took or bussed a couple black students from the general program into our class and said pretend like you're looking at a whatever, microscope or whatever, so you can sort of make it, so for the photo op, right? Horrible, right? So there was a sense of me as a black student thinking, gee, am I the only person who gets what's going on here? Because everyone else kind of seemed oblivious to it. So to be fair, the experience wasn't perfect. But what I would say is, though, that the experience, at the same time, though, it exposed me to something that I'd never thought was possible. And so it was the first time when I sort of refashioned my relationship to the world. So if you had asked me as a 14-year-old, could I become a doctor? Or written a book, these things would have been just completely inconceivable. I would never have imagined they would ever been possible for me. And so this teacher, she was a white woman. She was probably in her late 40s at the time, maybe early 40s. She really took it upon herself to make a real difference, right? It's this idea of doing a small thing. I'm just one person, right? But she really helped transform the trajectory of my life. And people may think that, well, oh, you would have done fine regardless. But there's so many people that I grew up with who were really bright, really smart, that one opportunity didn't happen, and their life went in an entirely different direction. And these are things that I think people often don't realize how it plays out. And so there's this idea of someone doing a small thing and really helping to transform someone's life. I mean, honestly, there's no way I could ever imagine being a place like this or being a doctor as a 14-year-old version of myself. It was inconceivable. The first time I actually saw an African-American person who was a physician, I was like 17 or 18 years old. I mean, other than like something on TV, but in real life, in the flesh, 17 or 18 years old, it was inconceivable. But this person put me on a path where I could actually envision that for myself. So I challenge all of you as you go out in the world, think about what you can do in life. There are all sorts of ways in which you can kind of make that one difference. And again, the person may not listen the first time. It may take, and that's the thing sometimes we lose sight of. We'll say, well, they don't know what's best for them or that kind of thing. But a lot of times people just haven't had this opportunity to sort of envision their relationship to the world. And I think that's something that we often lose sight of. So I want to challenge you as you move forward to think about that and the ways in which you can do that. And everyone can do it. You don't have to be a teacher or a doctor or anything like that. I think often we lose sight of those things. So I want to challenge you as you move forward to think about what is that small thing that you can do to make this, make these divisions better. So I want to leave you with that, and then we'll move forward. So thank you.
Welcome back, and I hope you've had a relaxing break. We have had a wonderful influx of questions from the audience as well as from our friends at Granite State and the University of Vermont. The questions really cover a wide range, and so and John and I have sort of pre-sorted to try to get most of the topics that have been asked covered. And so I'm going to just start with a very common one. Most of our audience is white, and I acknowledge my guilt, and all of us, regardless of race, are guilty of implicit bias, which probably in our Neanderthal days served us well in keeping us safe, and these days not so much. Beyond what you have said, what can a white person do in everyday life to help bridge this racial divide?
Okay. First of all, just thanks everyone for sticking around. Yes. So yeah, you certainly did state the obvious. And so as far as what folks can do, well, I gave one example at the end, right? So that's one kind of thing. I think there's also just this idea of not letting things go, like kind of sort of calling things out when you see it. It's happened, for instance, me as a man in the medical world. Medicine's had its own sort of ugly history with how it's treated women who are doctors, and there's been times when things happen. Even me, as from my perspective, maybe I should have kind of sat on the sidelines and I didn't say anything, or I kind of let things go, didn't do anything. I think there's a tendency for folks. There's a great quote by Dr. King and others who sort of talk about how the person who sort of stands on the sidelines is just as bad in some ways as the person who's sort of committing the act in its own way. I mean, I can't do justice to the quote, but I think there's also always just that idea, because you might be in a situation where someone is saying things or doing things that they wouldn't necessarily say or do in front of me, but they may in your presence, and being willing to sort of kind of speak up and and call it out for what it is. I think also for those of you, I mean, there's in many ways, it depends on what field you're in. I often feel like there's this tremendous, we can go on about the media for forever, and I mean, it's an easy target, but I think there's like a tremendous sense of how they shape narratives and how there's a tremendous need for us to sort of reshape and reframe our narratives, because so much of the implicit bias and all these things sort of stem from that. And I think these narratives that we sort of are reinforced in our society, they kind of poison all of us in their own ways. And how can we just sort of in our way continue to be sort of part of trying to reshape that? But I think on a smaller scale, it's just speaking out, advocating for people, doing whatever you can to sort of seeing someone and seeing that person, trying to see beyond that person as that member of a racial group, but as an individual, and what can you do to sort of try and help that person and try and put yourself in that person's place in some way as best you can. I think all those things are just so important and can be manifest in so many ways in your own lives depending on what you do. There's so many layers to that, and it's endless. I think the best way to do it is think about what is your passion. For instance, there's some patient I have who's an older white guy, and he's interested in chess, and he started this program at a school where he started teaching children how to play chess. Right, all these sort of small things that can be tremendously useful in the larger picture of life. So there's just so many ways, and so combining whatever your own passion is with a sense of helping others, I think is really the way to go.
Wonderful. Here is one, and I'll quote it directly. Had I been in your shoes in many of the experiences you describe that contained racial bias, I would have experienced enormous anger. Did you feel it, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah. There's different times in your life when you sort of do have that. You go through all sorts of emotions. Anger is certainly one of them. Many times I felt that way. But one thing I kind of, as I got older and sort of thought about, and so the book kind of describes that journey in some ways. There are times when I am quite angry. But one challenge with that is that, and some might not agree with this, but I feel like if I allow, like if I have an encounter with someone and there's a racial bias that I can detect from it, and I'll allow that person to generate that degree of anger and hatred within me, not beyond the physical effects it can have on my own body. In some ways, I've kind of ceded a power to them in some way, that they can sort of control me and control my emotional state. And so I've gotten to that point where I felt that way, and it's really helped me sort of cope and kind of move forward. Because, I remember I alluded to this issue of me having high blood pressure, so I didn't really kind of follow up with that. Some of that was probably, certainly related to diet that I'd grown up eating, and I sort of worked through that, but there was also this kind of internal stress that I was sort of carrying with me. There's this term called, John Henry's this sort of mythical figure who had the steel hammer, and there's a term called John Henryism, this idea that of African Americans who are trying to succeed in society, sort of having this extra layer of stress, of coping with that. And there was an interesting study actually a couple years ago suggesting that in most cases people who are more successful are healthier, right, in terms of socioeconomically, but there was some suggestion that maybe African American people who were more successful were actually experiencing some higher degree of health problems. And I think it could be connected to this idea of trying to navigate that ladder and pushing and fighting. So the anger I found ultimately was only useful to the extent that I could constructively make it something to help me. But lashing out was almost like a way of sort of giving power to someone else and letting that person write my story in a way. And so that was something that I sort of come to move forward with.
It's a different level of awareness to acknowledge the emotion that somebody else raises in you and respond to it creatively. Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, certainly I haven't always been that way. There's times when I wanted to say all sorts of things to people. And there's times when I probably have, but that's about maturity in life.
What about African American women in medical school? Is it harder it has been in the past hard enough for women entering medicine, who are now well over 50% of most medical school classes. Is it more difficult for African American women?
So the demographics are actually interesting. So historically, medicine's been a very male-dominated professional course. But among African Americans, actually women have outpaced African American men for some time. And actually the numbers now are about 2 to 1 easily, women to men. You look at most medical schools, I've traveled a lot the last several years. It's nothing to go to, it's not surprising to go to a medical school, see a class of students, there'll be 7 or 8, 9 women and maybe 1 or 2 men. That's a really common pattern that you'll see. And it's true in other areas of education. Black women have sort of outpaced African American men in a disproportionate way that you would see in other racial and ethnic groups. A lot of reasons why. I think there's just a fundamental narrative about African American men and how society sees African American men and how that, again, impacts how African American men see themselves. I told you before about how I couldn't have seen myself as a professor or a doctor. There was a narrative that has sort of been it sucks you in, and you almost sort of, go in that direction. And so, I mean, it's like the idea of, like, in my neighborhood, if you were going to go to college and you were a black man, you had to play football or basketball, and that was sort of the narrative that it kind of seeped through society. And if you didn't, that's the positive, but then the negative is all this sort of sense of threat and criminal justice and that sort of thing. I think those things impact people, how they see themselves and their relationship to the world. And so I think there's a tremendous, that's why I talk about this narrative, the tremendously negative narrative that we have to continue to combat. But I think, back to your question, women actually outpace men, but that doesn't mean that there aren't real challenges that they face. My wife is an African-American female physician, and she would always get this, some of it is hard to tease out how much of it was based on gender, how much was based on race. It's hard to sort of tease it out in her case. But several times, there was one time where she was at the hospital and she was coming to see a patient, and the patient actually a while later complained that they hadn't actually seen a doctor the whole time they were there. But of course, my wife was seeing this person daily. So again, how do you tease out how much of that was based on her being a woman versus being African American? It's hard to tease that out, but there's certainly some real challenges they face. Yeah.
A bit of a change here. Do you have any thoughts over the controversy over the removal of Confederate monuments from schools and cities in the South?
Let's just get right to it. Huh? All right, so that goes outside the realm of medicine, of course. Oh gosh, I mean, I've kind of a couple of different minds of it. I mean, on one side, there's this idea of, like for instance, in South Carolina, being on the state capitol and having the Confederate flag there. And the irony of it is sort of like, understanding the history of that flag was not put there in it was put there like in 1960 or 58 to protest integration. I mean, so it's like understanding that whole context is very useful. So I think on a state sanction, so I would say there is a pretty clear divide. You shouldn't have it like on state sanctioned property. I think there's a real horrible message that can be sent in that way. Now, if you're talking about other aspects of the removal of monuments and things of that nature, I think it's a little complicated, because I think there's some value in sort of understanding, maybe it shouldn't be in a celebratory way, but there's value in understanding kind of our journey and where we've been and where we've gone. And there's some value to that. Maybe it needs to be better contextualized, like, this was here, this was put here for this reason and this time, so we can understand it from a historical standpoint. I don't know if just necessarily erasing all of it in some way. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the right way. Now, again, if it's on like a state ground, state property, I feel a little different about it, but it's worth having the larger discussion, because I got to say something. What's I think is interesting in the last couple of years with this whole discussion about Robert E. Lee, right? I think I got to be honest, even me. I mean, I certainly read about Robert E. Lee growing up. I know a lot more about him now. Read a lot more about him the last year or two than I ever had before. There's certain value in bringing this out, having this discussion, learning about it, reading what he actually said, what he thought about things. The most ironic thing that he actually said, I think, is that he himself talked about how we shouldn't really celebrate. We shouldn't have all these monuments in some ways to us, because it's going to continue to sow division. I mean, it was like he's so, he could really look into the future and see that. And so it's really, I think there's an opportunity for us to learn in some ways from this. So I'm kind of two minds. I think there's some cases where we clearly need to take things down, and others where I think it's an opportunity to actually have a better and larger discussion. I think it just sort of depends on the situation.
Thank you. I must say I felt very much conflicted about it myself for those reasons.
But I've learned learned a lot more about it. For instance, in Baltimore, I didn't know Roger B. Taney, Supreme Court Justice, Dred Scott decision, which basically said that black people weren't citizens right before the Civil War. There's a statue up to him up in the Baltimore area, and again, just another example of like getting an opportunity to, even as someone who's an educated person, the opportunity to really learn more. I think there's a real value in that. Yeah, so this discussion needs to be had.
It's still our history.
Yeah. In all of its ugliness, but it's always something we need to know.
This is from the University of Vermont, and it's a two-part question. What happened to Mrs. Robertson? Did she ever get the care she needed?
Ah, that's a great question. So, sadly, this is a larger discussion about medical education and the way that it's done, and so it's like you're thrown into a situation, and then you sort of are thrust out of it, and it's really hard to kind of follow up and know what happens. And I think that's one of the problems with medical education in it's a larger discussion. So no, the answer is, you sort of come in, you see the situation, and you don't really know, and you sort of left to wonder and ponder what became of her. So honestly, I don't know. I know that she came back. I know that they were able to give her some medications for her blood pressure, but beyond actually that, I don't know what happens. So that's sort of the sad part about some of these stories.
And also from University of Vermont, in a future administration, when you are an advisor to HHS, Health and Human Services, what 3 main policy changes would you advise?
We might have to come back to that one a little bit. Yeah, I mean, actually, I have I don't know how far I want to go into this, but you said a future administration, so I actually have someone that I know who's in the current administration in the healthcare capacity. What would need to change? I mean, I think we have to have some large-scale commitment to this idea of health insurance and finding a system there's no perfect system. I think we have to start with that reality. There's no system that's just going to be perfect and work for everyone in all ways. But we have to sort of find a way to come together to have a baseline that there's really no reason that we would have people without health insurance. And there are just so many ways in which people sort of lose sight of how that impacts people. I gave you some examples clinically, but then a person can get sick and then no health insurance. They have these large bills, and I've had patients like lose their homes, and I mean just things that are it just makes there's no sense, because at the very least health insurance should protect you from the catastrophic things that can happen that are beyond your control, and we don't even have that. I mean, and so just something that at most minimum way we would have to have a system that covers that. Obamacare was a compromise that really was tenuous in a political way, and I think any system there has to be a system that can somehow survive the political scrutiny of who's in office, because that's sort of a system that's ultimately kind of doomed to fail if it's on the winds of whoever's in office, whatever group's in power. So there's got to be some kind of system that can work. I would say that's the most basic thing that we need to do. I'll come back. I'll answer the other two. I'll think about it more and come back and answer the other questions. I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's a great question. But I think first and foremost, we have to find a system that can address that. We also have to kind of, just one way, move towards a larger system of prevention versus just sort of the treatment model of we're treating acute care illness and we're not dealing with the larger scale issues of prevention. There's so many layers to that. I think about medical education. Again, I mentioned we had one lecture on nutrition in 4 years, as if somehow nutrition has no bearing on health, right? And so, I mean, there's just so many large-scale changes that need to happen. Our whole system is sort of focused on this kind of acute treatment model, the way it's funded. All those things kind of have to be looked at in some larger way. And critics will say as some part of some kind of like social, I mean, these people use these terms and they don't even really know what they actually mean sometimes. You know, they'll use terms like socialism or communism or fascism or whatever, and these terms are just thrown about, and people don't even really know what they mean. The idea that you want a system that focuses on prevention and helping people make healthier choices, that's logic. That doesn't really have any political. To me, it's just common sense, right? And somehow we've sort of gotten wrapped into this sort of political ideology, which seems kind of illogical to me. But we need a system to focus more on how do we prevent illness rather than just focus on the treatment-based model.
Amen. Yeah. Do you have? This is from Granite State now. Do you have any suggestions for how to attract more African American doctors and nurses to northern New England?
They got to come this time of year, I guess, right? Because it's maybe that's the problem. You know, because when you do those interviews for residency and medical school, they tend to be like in November and December and January, and you know, maybe that's part of it. But yeah, no, seriously. I mean, I think it's a wonderful area. But I myself probably, had I not experienced it, having a chance, I mean, I initially had my own preconceptions and aversions to an area where you look at the demographic data and it says like, what, 1% or African American, and so if you come from like an area of the South where there's that can scare you off because just based on that alone. But I think it's personally a great area. I think, again, seriously, even having opportunities to come at different times of the year, there'd be some value in that because I think it's beautiful. I think also showing that people, because some people might think that, well, if I'm in an area where there's such a lower African American population, maybe I can't be as one about myself and my family and will we fit in and all those kinds of thoughts, but even more about maybe can I be as helpful or as great a service as maybe I could be elsewhere. I think there's some that people probably struggle with as well. So I think making the convincing case that there's a real value and importance for them, and that you're going to be welcome, and that there's also a real value to you that you could add beyond just sort of face value, but in a real way it could be helpful. So just kind of reshaping that narrative as well could be helpful. It's a challenge. But I think it's really a valuable one to pursue.
This is another change of direction. In what ways can American leaders encourage inner city youth to make education a higher priority?
Okay. What way can American leaders?
American leaders.
Yeah. It's a loaded question. I mean, there's a lot of layers to that. I think on some level, I mean, there's no doubt that education is, I would say, the ultimate sort of neutralizer in some ways. It's certainly, I think about my own family journey and, my family growing up in, a segregated South and how education's afforded my brother and our opportunities we never could have, envisioned otherwise. There's a lot of layers to it. One is just the idea of like, on the most basic level, you have to have a certain sense of like security to make that something that, because, there's a whole hierarchy of needs kind of thing that people talk about. And I think we have to sort of find more creative ways to sort of get I think that really hardcore isolated segregation is really destructive and harmful for people, and how do we find more creative ways to sort of break up some of that entrenched sort of deep segregation that sort of exists and sort of takes on its own life, which I think makes it really difficult. There are these larger cultural narratives that I've talked about earlier that are prevalent and powerful, and they start at the very highest of society and they sort of infiltrate down. So the question is, how do we make it more of a priority? Is that what you're saying?
It's more,
yeah.
How do we encourage our leaders, white and African American, to encourage education, especially in our inner cities?
We need more creative ways to think about the school system, the education system, the process itself. We also need that as well. I mean, again, I was in a sort of low-performing school. You kind of languish in a school like that, but then I had another opportunity, and then things completely kind of changed. I mean, I think we have to find more creative ways to do that as well. Again, these things get mired in politics, and I think sometimes the kids kind of get left out in the larger framework. I mean, it's a complicated question. There's so many layers to it. I can't do justice to that question. I'm sorry whoever asked it. I love to do the psychiatry role and say, well, what do you think? And ask them if I knew who the person was. But because it's a really loaded question. But I think all these things kind of have to happen. I mean, there's multiple things that have to happen simultaneously to really make things work. I think there's such a tendency to sort of only. I think in some ways there's a tendency to sort of, because again there's a narrative and there's a tendency to focus on how everything is bad. But there are actually a lot of stories of people in these environments who are actually doing really well. And what are we doing? How can we replicate that? How can we expand that? But I think there's a narrative, there's a tendency to sort of reflexively kind of rely on what the media is telling you and to kind of go in these sort of negative directions. I don't think it's not always as bad as it seems. That's what I would say. So anyway, I mean, I'll think more about it. I don't like my answer. I'm going to think more about it.
I liked your ending story of the teacher who encouraged you, and all of us have an opportunity to do things like that, and it crosses not only racial lines but socioeconomic.
Sure, sure.
There have been a number of articles in leading medical journals recently about the issues of patients requesting to see a doctor of their own race, or more specifically, not to see a doctor of another race. How is that best dealt with?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, there's been a lot of that. I mean, there wasn't much talk about that till more recent years. I remember New England Journal of Medicine tried to sort of come up with some kind of like consensus, expert consensus statement as to how to approach it. Maybe a year or two ago, they published that. To one, I mean, I think it depends on the setting. Are we talking about something that's acute treatment, life-threatening, emergent treatment, or something that's more non-emergent? So, I mean, that's an important distinction as far as what we're going to need to do in that particular situation. Then we have to kind of understand, like, what is the motivation? What is the basis for the person's kind of request? What are we dealing with? If it's something that seems more like a kind of a pure kind of naked racial prejudice, I think this is where administrators and supervisors can take a really important role. There have been several situations that I've encountered, or other students have encountered, where we've had these kind of experiences where people will want to see you based on these kind of, the fact that you're black or you're Asian or whatever may be the case. I think it's really important for the people in leadership positions to sort of demonstrate a certain level of support, because a person can be in that situation and not kind of know what to do as the individual doctor, right? And so I think institutions can really make a really important point of sort of saying that this is this person's a doctor or a student at our institution. They're a really important piece of the team, and that unless there's some overwhelmingly compelling reason, we really shouldn't kind of go down that route of sort of requesting exclusively based on race, I would say. It's delicate, but I would say that we have to be really careful about that. I've had cases where supervisors have said, Dr. Tweedy, he's a physician here, and blah, 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 blah. And if you don't want to seek services, from him, you